So today, in today's lecture, we'll discuss endgames that occurred in my games, some of the games in the 2020 US Championships that I had an honor to play a few days ago. I think that they were pretty interesting. I played 5 of those endgames. I don't think we have enough time to cover all of them in detail. However, at least 2 or 3 of them I hope to cover today, and probably next time during the next lecture, or maybe in the future, I don't know, we'll see how it goes. We'll cover the rest. Nonetheless, for now, I think it's time to start talking about the games I have in mind. In the first game, it was I played against some Sevian, and after a very sharp opening and complicated fight in the middle game, we achieved the following position. I should probably flip the board because we are interested from Black's perspective right now, mostly because I play with Black pieces. So we got this endgame, and objectively is around equal. However, White at first, if only I would be able to preserve my knight and escape with it, let's say to c5 in the future, I think Black would have had chances to be better. However, it is pretty much not feasible, and because White can play anyone, basically bishop takes e4 and eliminate the knight, resulting in a rook endgame. And this is exactly what happened in the game, actually. So in the game happened king g1, and I played move g6 with a natural move. I couldn't play knight c5 right now because after knight c5 I would have lost the pawn, and I would be in trouble, so I didn't want to allow that. Therefore, at first I played g6, bishop takes e4, and here I just simply decided to take with the pawn on e4. However, there was an alternative which was probably even stronger. However, it would lead to similar probably outcome. Rook f8. The idea is that I want to keep 2 rooks on the board, but I don't think it changes much, and position still remains equal. For instance, after c4 I have to take back on e4 with the pawn probably, or with the rook also is fine. It should be around equal everything. But the position I really want to discuss is the one how it happened in the game, because out of nowhere, it's in the seemingly equal endgame, I got into trouble, and all the source of this trouble was because at some point we both started playing on basically less than 10 seconds. However, here we still had like few minutes, so let's see how the game followed and what happened that such complications later happened. So king takes f8, c4 obviously. Right now e3 is a move that I have to play. This is the move I saw that I had to play when I played move f takes e4. Otherwise, if I play, let's say, king e7 or something, I would only be worse if he manages to play king f2 and then Vadia king e3, and pawn on e4 would be pretty much a weakness. Therefore, I have to make sure that I prevent his king from entering to e3, and same time I advance my pawn and activate my rook. In the game happened b3, strengthening the pawn structure, and here's the first critical position, because I have a choice. There is no kind of like pretty much equivalent. The problem is what to choose here as Black. Both moves that I have in mind right now, and I had in mind during the game, lead to equal position, obviously. However, one is a little bit more accurate than the other, from purely practical standpoint. So, in the game I played Rook E4, and the idea is obviously to simplify the position with the next A4, and the game should, I was thinking the game should end to further simplifications and eventually a draw. And and this is correct, obviously. However, king e7, there was an alternative, and I was considering this move. I wasn't sure which one to choose, so I decided to choose simplicity, and that's why I played Rook e4 with idea of a4. However, king e7 is also very good. The problem is, or like why I didn't play this, is that I was a little bit skeptical what happens after moves like g3 or g4. For instance, after g3, his idea was obviously king g2, king f3. And the idea to simply win this e3 pawn. If he wins the pawn and transfers to the pawn endgame, I will be lost pretty much. However, there is a very important move that black has right now, and during the game I didn't quite consider it, and that's the reason why I didn't go for it. And this move is g5. The point is that I try to, if he plays king g2, I play simply g4. And I further restrict his king, and my king, if he doesn't do anything special, I even have chances to win this game. If I can bring my king to f6, f5, e4, my king will be super active. Pawn e3 is very strong as well. I may have chances to win the game. So if I will kind of from practical perspective, it would be a pretty good try for me to, let's say, maybe win the game. Of course, positions equal, and with, let's say, not so difficult moves like, for instance, h3 and right now king f1, bringing the king this way, he would easily solve his problems, or like not even solve. There are not any problems, but like solve the issue of, let's say, king invasion with king f6, king f5. And king comes to e2, rook gets activated. For instance, if king f6, rook e1, king f5, king e2, king e4, and rook f1. And he activates his rook. He's definitely not in trouble anymore, or like he never was, pretty much. And he activates his rook to f7 or f6, and position gets a little bit sharp, but objectively position is equal, and it should end in a draw. So this was possible to play, and but the very important idea that I wanted to point out here is again this idea of g5 or idea of g4. If someone may ask, what happens after, let's say, let's why play g4, not to even allow this. If g5, of course, king g2, king f3, well, white wins. But g4 on the other hand has this problem that pawn g4 is a little bit exposed and is subject to immediate attack with rook e4. And after h3, if g5, we can consider playing at some point rook g4, obviously. And another thing is that after king g2, we can take the pawn on g4. And after h3, suddenly king f6 could be actually even possibly better for black. At least at any point, if I want to be super safe as black, I can play also a4 and just eliminate all the pawns. So there was actually no need to play this rook e4. Therefore, if I start with king e7, I would be completely fine as well. And maybe if he made some mistakes, or maybe we have some chances to win, especially it's rapid, so anything can happen. However, I played move rook e4 with the idea of simplifying the position with a4, rook takes c4, king f1, a4, following the plan. Now rook takes c4, rook takes after rook takes e3, rook takes a4. There is not much to discuss, pretty much, I think, because I play next move rook b4 or rook d4. I eliminate one of his pawns, and the for example line could follow with rook c3, rook b4, check, wins the pawn. But let's say h5, for instance, and I will collect d5 pawn at some point. The b pawn was not going anywhere. White's king is very passive. There is no way that white can win this. Position is pretty much just a draw. Therefore, some played move rook a2, which is more ambitious. And here, the idea of rook a2, yes, it is a passive move, but on the other hand, it contains a big threat. a5. Let's say if I play something inaccurate, let's say rook d4 possibly could be inaccurate. I have to face a5 right now, and if he plays a6, a7, he will basically promote the queen. So I figured that after rook a2, I need to be kind of careful, and that's why I played rook c5. To prevent a5, because if a5, of course, I take the pawn on b5, and also I attack on d5. So this was okay. However, there was probably even simpler way to play for me. Let's, for instance, just b6, and like after king e2, rook c3. And I honestly don't think that there is any there are any problems here for black. If a5, I just take, and we simplify further the position. He doesn't have the passed pawn well supported. His b5 pawn, which is passed pawn, but it's not well supported as earlier would be in this line, for instance, after rook d4, a5. Therefore, this was also quite easy. I decided, but you know, my approach was, my thinking here was, okay, I'm gonna simplify the position. It should end up in a draw, and this is also okay. Rook c5, king e2, king e7, rook king e3, rook d5. But here we got this endgame, and in here many things happened because suddenly I figured that if anyone could be better here, like slightly better, or like visually, let's say, have some better chances to win this game, is white. For the simple reason, there are two pawns on the queen side, and if there is possibility, and there's higher possibility of making the outside passed pawn for white rather than for black, who has central passed pawn, but it doesn't quite go anywhere because white king is very active, and yeah, so basically this d pawn doesn't really go anywhere. And if he may have ideas rook c2, rook c7, for instance, if he can bring his rook there and somehow eliminate this pawn, he will have two passed pawns versus 0. So I saw this danger, you know, somewhere in my calculations, but still I believe that black is completely okay. But the thing is, over the board when you're playing the game, and sometimes you know the position is equal, but you still face some or encounter some practical difficulties, it's not entirely easy to react to those, especially with such time controls like rapid game or blitz. And if classical chess, of course, is way different, but in rapid and blitz is also like blitz and rapid have its own rules as well. So in the game happened rook c2, king d7. Idea is, of course, for black, for white, one of the ideas for white is to play b6 and rook c7. However, if b6, it basically overextends a little bit the pawn structure as well, and I can play, I think, just rook e5 check. And the idea is to play at some point rook a5 and attack this a4 pawn, but starting with this check. Like, for instance, the idea is that after this, suddenly I'll take here on a4 with the check very often. So, or I can play also immediately, or another idea is to play rook c5 here. And I think actually rook c5 is the simplest. So b6 doesn't really quite lead anywhere. He played king e4, rook h5, activate the rook, g3, rook e5. All those moves are pretty standard. Right now nothing really happens. White has no threat, and I decided right now to play move h5. As earlier in this position, just I'll bring it once again, if b6 I have this idea, or it is this rook a5 to capture the pawn, or even stronger with rook c5, covering the c file, and if of course takes, rook takes c5, pawn takes, this pawn c6 is simply falling, pawn b6 is simply falling because a5 king b5. And I think actually black is winning suddenly, so he doesn't achieve here anything. In this position, as we had in the game, b6 right now, after if he plays b6, rook c5 is not possible anymore. But I can, as I said earlier, I can switch the plan basically to the attacking this a4 pawn, especially that rook c7 doesn't come with the attack on the h7 pawn as well. So here I can play probably just rook a5 with pretty simple draw. For instance, this. After king c3, let's say, is pretty logical. I don't think I would have any serious problems after, let's say, king d5. This should be quite easy draw here. Whenever he plays this, I can play, for instance, this, and rook b6, rook behind the pawn. It's one of the most important rules in the endgame, rook endgames. And if he goes anything else like this, I can consider playing just. Oh wait, maybe king d5 is a little bit inaccurate. A little bit more. I should be a little bit more careful right now. But for instance, I can play rook a1 and activate my rook and bring the rook from the back, and should be also a draw. Let's say rook a1. It should be quite easy draw. So in this position, he played rook f2. And I saw during the game that if he plays rook f2, I can always play king e7, rook c2, king d7. I saw this possibility of simply making this repetition here as with the king d7, king e7. The very important thing is not to allow rook f7 invasion or rook c7 on the 7th rank, because if I lose b7 pawn, as I said earlier, there will be 2 passed pawns, a4, b5 versus 0. So there's something really to watch out for in this endgame. For instance, king e6 would be probably already a mistake, maybe, or at least big an inaccuracy, because it allows rook f8. So some care is necessary as well. King e7, rook f3, some waiting move. I played right now b6 in order to make sure that these pawns are not going anywhere. He never can play a5 right now. Rook b3, idea is to play a5 and push the pawn forward. I play of course king d7, and if after king d7, idea is to bring the king close enough that if a5 never works, because I will block the b5 b pawn with the king. For instance, if he plays right now a5, I would simply take b6, and I have, for instance, king c8, one of many moves. After this, I can play king b8, and I'm completely fine here. Probably still a draw, but you know, at least I won the pawn, and I don't have certainly any problems here as black. Also, possibly I could consider playing rook e8, rook b8. However, this is a little bit passive, and I'm not quite a big fan of that. However, it's also possible. And here he played rook c3, and this was actually an interesting moment, because right now the threat is rook c6, obviously, and to attack the b6 pawn and try to win it. And I had many moves right now. I can think of 3 of them right now that I can easily play, and I'm totally fine. I chose one of them. However, the point is that from psychological perspective, sometimes it's not easy to decide on the move in such situation, because because sometimes too much choice is a problem. Like if you play one very natural move to me that occurred during the game was rook e1, and this is the move that I played, and it is a really good move because it activates the rook, and I want to give some checks from behind and play rook. I always catch the a4 pawn with rook a1, and this is totally okay. And however, there are other moves, and one of the moves that I consider is rook c5. But rook c5, you know, in shorter time control, is very committal move, because you have to evaluate the endgame, pawn endgame, a rising pawn endgame. And if the pawn endgame, and at the moment you are not entirely sure, because of the nerves, because of the time pressure, because of the, you know, prestige of the tournament and things like that, it's not easy to make such a committal decision during the game. However, of course, rook c5 is okay, because after rook c5, when you are cool-headed, it's easy to see. Obviously, after let's say king d5, just go king c7, and white has no way to make progress, even though white has a more active king, because this pawn on c5 was supported by the b6 pawn, and this king can never go escape the box, or like the square of this pawn on c5, and you know, the game pretty much ends with just repeating moves and draw. Let's say king e5, king d5, white can never lose this, but also black cannot never win this. Of course, would be a very sketchy, or like very suspicious, at least unnecessary to be you know, very precise, to go for this, because for white, because here white never can win this, only black can win this, because black has outside pass pawn, and probably it still should be a draw, I will say very carefully. However, it's actually it could be already lost, because after king b7, b6, a4, king b4, this, king c5, it is black that is simply much faster to the king side, and while white king is far away. So that's the power of outside pass pawn. You can give it away, and you're then, after taking your opponent's pawn, your king will be a little bit closer to the center and the other side of the board, so you're simply faster. So this, if my understanding is correct, it could be simply already winning for black. So this is completely unnecessary for white to go for his a5 move. Another possible, so rook c5 was basically the simplest, but you have to calculate rook c5 and evaluate it. And at the moment I didn't have, you know, time. We both had like maybe, you know, 15-20 seconds here. We both had like very little time. We were playing on increment. So in this stressful situation, I decided to play Rook E1. Another possibility is to play Rook G5 with the idea of playing Rook G4 and attacking this A4 pawn over the 4th rank. And this is also completely okay, because after Rook C6, Rook G4, King D5, I can simply go back Rook G5. And after, but this is, I think I also saw this, but I wasn't sure after King C4. And the answer after Rook C4, I cannot play this, because pawn A4 is defended and pawn B6 falls. But again, I have moved Rook C5, which I didn't kind of see because I dismissed it earlier, so I didn't include my calculations already here. So and it's basically essentially the same position as earlier, because it's just a draw, right? Yeah, so Rook G5 also was working. So finally I played move Rook E1, and after Rook E1, Rook C6, Rook D. It's very important to play move Rook D1, and the idea is to kick away our white's king away from the center, because if, for instance, I played Rook A1, I would be in trouble after Rook takes B6, Rook takes A4, and suddenly King D5. His king would get to D5 square. I don't have check right now. Pawn D6 is falling, and with it probably G6 pawn as well. Well, I have weaknesses and I don't have check to my opponent's king, and I'm pretty much lost right now. So this is very important. It was a very important check. Rook D1, King E4, and again Rook A1 right now would be the same mistake, because after Rook A1, Rook B6, Rook A4, and King D5, white wins, is the same position. So again I have to give another check. He goes King F4, and I go Rook A1 right now, because after Rook B6 in this position I go Rook A4, and his king is not coming to D5, right? So this was my point. And after King G5, it seems like I'm losing the G6 pawn, but I have Rook G4, and probably afterwards H4, and simplifying completely the position, and it's just a draw. So Sam played Rook C4, defending the pawn, and it was actually very tricky move, because after Rook C4, the most natural response for black is to play D5. And this was, I guess, his small, let's say, practical trap, I would say, because D5 is, of course, the most natural move. You know, Rook C4 goes back, and I play D5. If he goes, let's say, Rook D4 or something, I go King D6, I activate my king, and I will have maybe even chances to win this game, because suddenly my king is very active. I have already passed pawn. My rook is also very active. What I mean is, like, after D5, Rook D4, King D6, suddenly black would be doing very well. I think black would have even good chances to win this game. And however, after D5, he instantly played Rook C6, and I realized that I may have made a mistake, because after I moved my pawn from D6, I allowed his king. I allowed his king to get to E5 square, and suddenly his king is very active. Rook is very active. My king is passive. And even despite I'm winning the pawn on A4, his king is very active, and he will recapture his pawn back very soon. So this was his trick here, which I missed, obviously. But it's still not lost or anything. It's just still completely okay. I made later a mistake. I will point out where and when. So another possibility was here to play King E6. And this was also okay, basically activating my king, and this should be a draw, because for this I go D5, Rook C6, King E5, Rook takes B6, Rook takes A4, Rook King takes G6, and H4. And with such active king, I don't think, and already passed pawn, like very advanced on D5, and you know, quite going forward quite quickly, D4, D3, D2. It should be quite easy to draw right now as well. What I analyzed later with the engines, you know, after the game, is that I discovered that it's actually not so simple for black to make this draw, and there's only maybe more, but like one clear idea that engine suggests, which is very difficult to find over the board. So I wouldn't criticize myself over playing D5 too hastily, but because I think it was a good decision. Because here, if I play this King E6, suddenly it's becoming very tricky. For instance, King G5 takes, D4 seemingly is just okay. But what happens after Rook B8 is the question. If he can play, let's say, B6, B7, and then check my king, he will win. right? And there is essentially one very nice idea for black to save this game. It is to play a move d3, for instance, b6, rook b4, b7. Seemingly I'm lost because rook e8 is unstoppable, and right now the move is rook b5, and this is brilliant resource for black. The idea is that whenever the king rook e8 happens, there will be some check, and the d pawn also will go forward, and there will be basically a trade. For instance, if king g4, we can play probably just d2, rook d8, because he has to stop this pawn somehow. Sorry, rook b7, rook takes d2, and king f6, and this is very, very simple draw. So yeah, this is one of this rook b5 move here is very important. Otherwise, it would be simply lost, because, for instance, d2 would result with this. Let's say I don't know, king anywhere, b8 queen, takes, and after d1 queen, rook e, rook d8. So basically with rook b5 we are making ourselves space to go with our king to f6 earlier, because the white king will be already on g4 in this line, as I said. After rook b5, king g4, for instance, d2, and he will achieve this drawish position. So king e6 was also making a draw. However, I played d5, rook c6, rook takes a4, king e5. In this position, I sort of was already, I knew that it has to be a draw. Like, I didn't do anything wrong in this game. Maybe I made some inaccuracies, of course, but like I didn't do anything terrible. And I have this rook endgame with extra pawn, even though I'm quite passive. But I'm on the move, and I know that I knew that it should be a draw. So I played move right now h4, which from principle point of view is correct, because the rules, rule of thumb sort of, is if you trade all the pawns, there will be no, or like as many pawns as possible, simplify the position as much as possible, there will be not enough attacking resources for your opponent to win the game. And this was my reasoning behind playing h4. There was even probably simpler move rook g4, and then after rook b6 d4, but I didn't consider this. Here, as I said, we played already like on increment and 5-second increment, which is very little time. So I decided to play h4. And after rook takes g6, h takes g3, pawn takes g3, I played rook b4. This was my idea when I played h4. Kind of like instinctively I saw the rook b4, and after rook b6, that he cannot defend this g3 pawn after move like rook g4. And this was instinctively what I saw, that he cannot defend this pawn, and I'm simply collecting g3 pawn, and my king is very close to the queen side, and it's just a draw. But suddenly it is not so simple, and actually I'm lost here, and I will show in a moment why. So in this position, the only path to draw right now for black is to play move d4. And of course I didn't consider this move. Only move that I considered was rook g4, as I said. But we were both playing on increment, 5-second increment, and we had no time here to think whatsoever. Or like to think too deeply. So I intuitively played rook g4, and thinking that I'm just collecting g3 pawn is the draw, but my calculation was wrong right now. So instead, if I played move d4 right now, king e4, and now king c7, this would be a draw, because right now he cannot. First of all, he cannot allow my pawn to go forward too much, and if he collects this d pawn with his rook, he will drop b5 pawn, and that's the main reason for it to be a draw. So he has to stop the pawn of the king. And if I play king c7 right now, rook c6, I go simply king d7, and there is some certain issue with this b5 pawn. He cannot really resolve it easily, because if he plays rook c5, I just go king d6. If he goes rook d5, I just go king e6, and whenever he takes d4 pawn, I take b5 pawn, and it's just immediate draw. However, one thing I want to point out, seemingly after this d4, like last two moves, d4, king e4, d3 would be making a draw, right? Like it seems like just pawn trade. You take king takes d3, rook b3, king c4, rook g3, and we simplified totally the position. It can be even nearly more simplified. And you know, there is b pawn, which theoretically should be you know, not should be drawn. Basically, this onion should, and you know, normally this onion should be drawn if only black king is close enough to the pawn. And it seems like this king is close to the pawn, because on d7 it's like, you know, only c7 could be closer, right? But this is the thing. Suddenly it's not close enough. After right now white move rook c6, it is winning for white, because white king suddenly black king is suddenly cut on the c file, and white, there is no way to stop black king from going forward. And then if the white king goes forward, it's basically theoretical position of building a bridge, and it's simply winning. Just to show, for example, is one of the most well-known rook endgames. So with rook g4, let's say king c5, let's say here, just it doesn't quite matter, just lost after anything. This b6 pawn, there is no way to stop this pawn. Rook c1, for instance, I don't know, rook a, I mean anything, rook a2, let's say check, king goes here, rook c2, king b8, this, and for instance rook a2. And again, right now the way to win this for white is to play move rook d4, and the idea is that after move like rook a1, we simply go with the king. And finally, that's why we need rook on d4, because right now we play rook b4, and we sort of build a bridge. It's called, I don't know why it's called a bridge, but like it's called a bridge on b4, and pawn b7 promotes to the queen. There is no way to stop that. So this will be after rook c6 right now, theoretically winning position. So even in such simple endgames, seemingly there are still lots of tricks, and that's the main reason why everyone should play, I guess, endgames till the end, because there's always some room for error, even if the simple ones, in the simple endgames. So or here I played move rook g4, seemingly the most natural move, right? And I basically rook g4, I attack the g3 pawn, I want to eliminate it and just immediate draw, right? Well, not so easy. Suddenly he played rook b7. After king c8, rook h7, rook g3, I achieved my goal, and this is just dead draw, because my king is right now very close to the b pawn, and I build sort of Philidor's position. This, you know, Philidor's position with b pawn, which is even, let's say, simpler than, you know, the one with the d pawn, let's say, because right now I don't have to even keep my rook on the 6th rank, I can even keep my rook on the 8th rank, and there is no way white could win that. But, you know, rook on 6th rank is basically Philidor's position, which is well, very well known, and it's obviously a draw. So this is what happened in the game. However, here some could have played a move that basically wins the game on the spot. However, you know, it's hard to blame him or whatever, because like we both had like here very few seconds, so anyone can make such a mistake. So the winning move was here rook d6, and seemingly there is no big difference between those checks, rook d6 or rook b7. But the point is that after rook d6, king c7, after king e7, for instance, the king would be very far away, so we would basically likely reach the position of which we discussed earlier, with the king being you know, very far away from the pawn, and then b pawn will be deciding. And after king c7, the problem is that right now rook c6 follows, and after king b7, rook c3 suddenly, and he manages to protect his g3 pawn, and I didn't get to win b5 pawn as well. For instance, and white is winning right now. After d4, for instance, rook b3, I think is the simplest move, because just to keep both pawns covered. And after king b6, simply king d5. I have pretty much no move. I cannot move anywhere my rook because I dropped this d4 pawn. If I move the king, he basically brings his king even further to the b5 pawn, and I cannot allow that to happen as well. So if d3, I try to distract his rook, he takes, and right now king e6, suddenly my king is right now too far away, and probably it would end up again either with the bridge position, or, you know, just the king is too far away. There is no way to stop this king and pawn setup, because just king is too far away. So yeah, this was very tough right now. Would be very tough for me right now after Rook G4. If he played Rook D6, probably would be just winning for white, and he would have won the game. But I guess I got lucky right now, and he played Rook B7, King C8, Rook H7, and this was just very simple draw. Here we played till the end, obviously, but the game ended here because it's stalemate. So this was it, and despite it being very seemingly boring endgame initially, suddenly it became very interesting. So I found this very instructive, and that's why I wanted to bring it up during this class. And yeah, so next game I wanted to talk about, I'm not sure how much time we have. I think we have more time for one more game. Is my game against Sam Shankland, and this time I was on the, let's say, side that was very close to winning actually. First of all, I was winning in the middle game, then I made a mistake, and he escaped into the Rook endgame with less pawns, less material, but with active pieces, and I didn't manage to convert it into a win, unfortunately. However, the position I would like to talk about is this one. At first, so last move was King F1, and for here I thought I'm simply winning after play move F4, and I simply disconnect the queen from the C4 pawn. I play Queen takes C4 next, and I'm seemingly just collecting the entire house, like just one pawn after another. My king is safe, his king is not safe. Seemingly, I thought I'm just completely winning right now, and the truth is that indeed I am, but I need to still prove it. So in the game I have the Rook G1, which was pretty much only move. Queen C4, King G2, F3, and yeah, I thought that you know, I can transfer to the Rook endgame right now with several extra pawns, like 2 extra pawns, and because after this, I collect on F6, and he doesn't have time to play Rook takes B6, which is what I saw, because I play Rook H6, and after King G5 I go Rook G6, and the Rook on G1 falls. But he played very quickly Rook G4, and suddenly I started realizing that it's not entirely trivial to win this. Despite it being 2 extra pawns for me, my pawns are not well guarded, and suddenly his pieces are immediately posing lots of threats to them, and I cannot easily also create a passed pawn, or, like, you know, stabilize the position, because I have passed pawn, H7 passed pawn, but it's still on H7 only, and he can attack or trade some pawns and simplify the position further, and here I think white suddenly has decent chances to make a draw here. So I kind of panicked right now, because I saw that I'm completely winning. Suddenly there is Rook endgame, which I thought is completely winning, but then I see, like, how do I defend the B6 pawn? Like, if I defend, he will activate his rook to the d file, let's say, and he will enter for the 7th rank. And always he can play King G3 and collect my F3 pawn at some point. So I noticed some practical difficulties I'm facing here, and I realized that it's not so easy to win this. And unfortunately, I immediately went wrong right now, because I played move B5. And B5 was a big mistake, because after B5 he could simply play A4, and this is exactly what I said. Pretty much the game. He trades one pair of pawns, and the likelihood of further trades is dramatically increased. Let's say if I take, he can play Rook B6. If I play, let's say, Rook C5, one of the possible moves, for instance, is Rook D1 and attacking through the back rank. So I have to respond to that somehow. Also, he can take here at first, then play Rook A1 or something. So there are with idea maybe Rook A1. So there are certain basically problems that with converting this into a win. So I played this B5, which was a mistake. But let's think about this position for a second. and try to understand what could be the winning or like, you know, possibly a good plan for black to win this. And after, you know, like studying this position, because I was really curious what's happening in this endgame, it kind of like it wasn't giving me a piece, kind of like, how is it really because a draw, or is there really such a good chances for white to make a draw here, or if it's a draw really, or indeed I should have some good chances to win this game as black. And the analytical approach proved that indeed black has very good chances to win this, but in reality it's never easy. And the reason for this is pieces activity. White rooks are very active, and my pawns are not well placed. They are constantly under some attack, and the probability of trades of, let's say, pawns on the queen side, because there are 2 rooks on the board, and pawn on a 3 basically being too far away, and like if the one pair of rooks is being traded, and pawn on a 3 will follow likely. All those factors contribute to the fact that it is not easy to win this position with black. However, with correct play and best play, computers engines show that indeed black should win in the end. But as I said, from practical level, it's never easy. So e5. So right now e5 was the best move, the best attempt to play for a win. And the reason why e5 not b5 is that b5 allows, you know, undermining of this pawn structure on the queen side with a4, right? And if I play e5, this is not possible. I cover b6 pawn through my rook on f6, but I didn't kind of like this move because I thought it leaves e5 pawn maybe vulnerable in some lines. But I can of course easily defend that after rook e1, rook e8 for instance, and rook e3, very logical move. Rook f5 for instance I can play. And the idea is that whenever he goes, let's say, move like king g3, I can play h4, h5, and this should be winning. Also, the point is that I try, for instance, after a4, you know, one of the, let's say, logical moves, I would be, I have an idea here to basically trade one pair of rooks in very good version for me. For instance, after a4, I was analyzing like a5, rook e4, trying to play rook c4, rook c6. But right now, I think that rook g8 would be winning for me. Because the thing is, after this, I've basically rook c4, I play rook f4, and this pawn endgame is winning for black, for the same reason we discussed earlier against my game in my game against Sam Sevian, because right now I have the outside pass pawn on the h7, and he will, even though he collects those 2 pawns, I will, I'm more than happy to give them as long as I keep the h7 pawn, because then h7 pawn will distract white king from defending f2 pawn, and then after trade of h7 pawn for f2 pawn, my king will be closer to the queen side, and I win the following endgame. For instance, after this, let's say this, requires calculation still, obviously, but it should be quite easily winning. Let's say after h5, this, I don't know, if king g3, he cannot go too far away because h pawn will promote the queen. So let's say this, and finally h4, and finally something like this would certainly be winning for black, because I'm just simply way closer to the queen side than white king is. So that's the reason why this idea of rook g8 would be winning. So of course, this I had no clue about such lines during the game. I basically made a immediately mistake, but for the educational purpose, I was to learn on my own. I wanted to learn how to basically approach such position, and basically the point is, at first secure all your pawns, and then try to win, try to trade one pair of rooks, and then create some threats, trying to make more, trying to eventually either trade the second pair of rooks, or, you know, if it's not possible, to trade one pair of rooks to at least stabilize all the pawn structure and make them well defended and improve the king. So this would be just general, some general strategy. I thought that c4 with idea rook a3 or rook b3, I should maybe add that arrow here, rook b3, rook b3, try to attack those pawns would be a feasible defensive resource for white. And indeed it is, but still black has some really good chances to win. And for instance a5, rook G4. Idea is to make sure that everything is protected. As I said, I want to play rook E6, A5. I want to have everything totally protected, and then if it's all protected, then I can slowly improve. Maybe trade one pair of rooks, improve my king. Only then. If it's not protected, it will be always constantly under attack. So rook E4, king G7, rook B3, rook E6, rook B5, and the idea is to play move C5 or something like this. And I thought it's not so easy here to win this position as well. And probably with best play, black can win this after move rook c6. But for instance, you know, the very typical move king f6 already doesn't lead anywhere. c5, rook c5. Pawn a4 is just, you know, very weak. If I have to play rook a6, my rooks are very passive. Pawn a3, as I said, doesn't really help me to help you know, with converting this endgame. So suddenly white has great chances to save this game. Also, idea after rook a6, rook a4, for instance, would basically sort of nearly clinch the draw, I guess. I don't know, like it is very unlikely that I would win. That black would technically win this. So instead, I thought rook c6 would be, you know, good try for at least good try for black to win this. And after this. King g3, try to win this endgame. However, after this, king g6, rook d5, rook b4, let's say king f3, we would achieve, let's say, such. I mean, by the way, this is all analysis with engine, so there is hardly room for improvement for any of the sides. And according to the engines, right now h5 gives black decent chances to win this game. However, over the board, it's not clear to me whatsoever if it's winning or if this is a win or not, because the material is really reduced to, you know, I'm not two pawns. I don't have two extra pawns. Only one extra pawn, and probability of trading a pawn for, let's say, b6, a2 pawn for b6 pawn, or maybe f for h pawns. It's quite substantial. I don't know, anything could happen. Of course, black has decent chances to win this, but by far I wouldn't say 100% is winning or something. Definitely good chances for black for win, but if it's winning, I am not entirely sure, at least. So this was the best way to play. As I'll say it again, all of the black's moves here to play e5, rook e8, let's say, then a5 here and rook e6, all those moves had one goal in mind: to make sure everything is protected, and then at some point trade a pair of rooks and improve the king and so on. But at first, guard everything. And unfortunately, this is not what I did in the game, because I played move b5, and he could have played immediately a4, which would result in a you know, nearly immediate draw. I was like, I played b5, then I saw a4, like, what am I doing after a4? Like, it's just immediate draw. But he didn't do it. He played rook d1, which was a little bit inaccurate. Still doesn't spoil really much, but it gives me some, again, chances to play this move e5, and after rook d7, let's say rook g8, with some good chances to, let's say, you know, put some fight here. It was for a win. It was still decent chances, but again, because he made a mistake, and I didn't again capitalize on it. And here I sort of, you know, panicked, or I don't know how to explain what was going through my mind. I played rook h6. I decided to trade rooks too early, and as you can probably see, after this rook d6, suddenly all my pawns are falling. Even though I have two extra pawns, I'm losing one of them. And if I had, for instance, already in this position my rook on c6, yes, this will be very good idea to play this, because then I have all my pawns protected, and I should have, if it's not winning objectively, I should have very good chances to win this in this rook endgame. But of course, my rook is on c6, and after he played rook d6, it was just basically a draw. So we played it out till the end. After a5, this. We played it out till the end. It's just quite simple draw right now. After a4, a3, rook a1, and yeah, I mean, this is just a draw. I decided to play a2 because whenever I move my king, I will drop this g6 pawn, which is what I didn't want. But if I play a2, I have simply no way to improve this position, because he just can stay with his rook. He can even just give this f4 pawn. He doesn't need it to make a draw, and this is just theoretical draw. We just played it out, but like, of course, just that draw. So the only thing that I would like to say, it would be winning with the white black pawn on f6 or on f5 somewhere, because then I will have possibility of playing f3 at some point, sacrificing a pawn, and kicking his king out of g2 and h2 squares, which would allow me to create, I mean, to basically check his king somehow, either from the side or from the back on f1. But of course, just to quickly show it, it probably is the last position I want to show. If, let's say, I put this pawn here on f6, this would be certainly winning right now for black, because let's say if f5, I can move my king anywhere, doesn't quite matter. f4, let's say, whatever, rook a7. f3, this will be the idea for black. But of course, pawns on g5 is not possible. But let's say if he takes, I would play rook f1. If white takes rook f1, if king f2, rook h1, rook a2, rook h2 is the winning idea here for black. Of course, all well known. I'm sure many of you know it. Just want to point it out because it was just some, I just found the utility for to show it, because it's very similar. This was the difference between pawns on f6 and g6, or f and g file. So this is how the game ended, with the pawn on g file, obviously not on f, and I had no way to make any progress here, and we played out till the end, like maybe 20 more moves or something, and we finally agreed to a draw. Or actually, it was like we played out to the two kings, and yeah, it was a draw. So yeah, I think that's pretty much all I had for today. I mean, I had, as I said initially, I had more endgames to show from this tournament. All very interesting. For example, my game against Hikaru Nakamura and Alejandro Ramirez were exceptionally interesting, and I'm more than happy to discuss them next time. However, for now, I think that my games against two Sams, some Sevian and some Shankland, were also very interesting, and they had some educational value. So that's all for today from me, and I will see you next time. Thank you, take care, have a good evening.